Hello everyone, I'm Bailey Miller,
And I'm Nathan Anderson.
and today we're going to be presenting on the clinical evaluation of language fundamentals, or the 5th edition, or the CELF-5. So we're going to start out with some general information about the CELF. The authors are Elizabeth Wigg, Eleanor Samel, and Wayne Secord. The test was published by Pearson and the last edition was updated in 2013. The price for the test is around $728, so it is more on the expensive side. The ages for the test are ages 5 to 21 years and 11 months, and there are different components for the test that are based on these ages that we'll go into more detail about later. The CELF can be administered by SLP, psychologists, and neuropsychologists, so just depends on what you're trying to do when you assess a client on who needs to use the test. The administration time for the core language score is about 30 to 45 minutes, and to give the entire assessment, the time is going to vary based on what all you give. That makes sense. Okay, so now the areas the test measures. The first area that you look at is the core language score, and it's broken down from ages 5 to 8 and ages 9 to 21. Ages 5 to 8 are comprised of the Receptive Language Index, Expressive Language Index, Language Content Index, and Language Structure Index. Ages 9 to 21 are comprised of Receptive Language Index, Expressive Language Index, Language Content Index, and Language Memory Index instead of the Language Structure Index. The other areas include assessments of receptive language, expressive language, language structure, language content, and language memory. So these are the subscale scores for the CELF. For ages 5 to 8, it's going to be based on sentence comprehension, linguistic concepts, word structure, word classes, following directions, formulated sentences, recalling sentences, understanding spoken paragraphs, and pragmatics profile. So then for ages 9 to 21, most of the same areas are going to be assessed as for ages 5 to 8, but in addition, it will look at word definitions, sentence assembly, and semantic relationships. Then there's also a section that's separate for reading and writing, and there's a section for ages 8 to 10 and ages 11 to 21, and they both assess reading comprehension skills and structured writing skills. Then there's also something called the Observational Rating Scale, which is an additional component that can be administered to obtain more information about a client. This can be used to help identify certain areas of concern within the classroom or within certain situations or contexts, so you can identify them in different settings. And this scale assesses the following skills: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. So now we're going to demonstrate some parts of the test. We can't demonstrate them all due to time constraints. So we're going to start out by demonstrating the word classes section of the test. I'm going to say some words and show you some pictures. Two of the words go together. Look and listen as I say the words. We have cat, cow, kitten.
Cat, kitten go together.
Okay, so since he got this correct, you would mark it as a 1, and if it was incorrect, you would mark it as a 0. Next, we're going to show the word definitions assessment, and this one is for the older ages of ages 9 to 21. And you don't need a stimulus book for this section. Okay, I'm going to tell you a word and use it in a sentence. I will then ask you to define the word and tell me what the word means. You can define or explain what a word means by telling what kind of thing it is and by telling some things about it. Okay. Mustard. Mom asked, "Would you like mustard on your hamburger?"
Mustard. It's a yellow substance like a condiment that you can put on your sandwich.
Okay. So since he included 2 descriptors for it, like it is a condiment and he included the color, they would get the check for both of these and that will be scored correct. Okay. And then we have the observational rating scale that was briefly mentioned earlier in the PowerPoint. And this can be filled out by a teacher, parent, or the student themselves if they're old enough. And it has the listening, speaking, reading, and writing assessments, and you would go through and you would fill out if it never, almost never happens, sometimes, often, always, or almost never, and then you mark if you're the teacher or the parent or the student filling this assessment out.
All right, so now we're going to talk about the normative sample. So the sample, it involved more than 3,000 children, adolescents, and young adults. It was stratified by age, sex, race, ethnicity, geographic location, and parent caregiver education level. And we did want to note that dialect was taken into consideration. Approximately 6.2% were reported to speak Southern English, 5.5% African American English, 4.5% English influenced by Spanish, less than 2% each of Central Midland, New England, New York City, and Appalachian English, and less than 1% Western Pennsylvania, Middle Atlantic English influenced by Chinese, or a dialect influenced by another non-English language. And the race ethnicities included were white, Hispanic, African American, and Asian. And there was another category, which it was kind of all inclusive of American Indian, Eskimo, Aleut, and Pacific Islander. The distribution of the sample included 4 geographic regions of the United States. Those were the South, which included 36.7%, the West, which included 24.2%, the Midwest, which included 23.8%, and the Northeast, which included 15.3%. Next, we're going to talk about the sensitivity and specificity. And the CELF identifies sensitivity as the probability that someone who has the condition would test positive for it. And it identifies specificity as the probability that someone who does not have the condition will test negative. So as you can see, with one standard deviation, with a standard cutoff score of 85, the sensitivity was 100% and the specificity was 91%. So pretty good overall. With 1.3 standard deviations, with a standard cut score of 80, the sensitivity was 97% and the specificity also was 97%. So still pretty good. And then with 1.5 standard deviations, the standard cut score was 77. The sensitivity was 85%. So we are seeing that 15% are not being identified, which is a little worrisome. But I will say that the manual does say that they still consider this very good to excellent. The specificity was 99%, which was good. And then with 2 standard deviations, the standard cut score being 70, the sensitivity was 57%, and the specificity was 100%. So, of course, that is not ideal for the sensitivity. All right, so the effectiveness in diagnosing language disorders. We do believe that based on the sensitivity and specificity, we feel that the test is effective in diagnosing language disorders when used in conjunction with criterion assessments and other types of observational assessments. And we do underline that because, as you know, it is important to do standardized testing as well as criterion assessments. And we also think it's important specifically for this test due to the fact that at 1.5 standard deviations, that it only is the sensitivity is only 85%. So there is that 15% that is not being identified. And we feel if there's criterion assessments and other observational assessments that we can perhaps identify those 15%. So the reasons for choosing this test. It does allow for the assessment, allows for the assessment of the student's language and communication skills in context. It allows you to determine if a language disorder is present. It also allows you to describe the nature of disorder, and it helps determine intervention treatment plans. And it's one of the, I guess, the biggest reason that we do see that you could choose this test is that especially if you just look at the record form for this assessment, you see that it really does try to assess all areas of language. And so if you really want something that's comprehensive and that is really going to analyze everything or all, as much as it can about a child, you would probably choose this test. That's a very good reason for choosing this test. All right, so our general impressions of this test. Our pros is that it is a comprehensive assessment, which also kind of could be a con, and we'll get to that in a little bit when we get to the time-consuming part. But it is comprehensive. It looks at everything, and I mentioned that just a second ago on the effectiveness slide. It is very informative. Um, it looks at like sentence comprehension, linguistic concepts, word structure, word classes, following directions. So it kind of just gives a good idea about all the components of language. And we also feel that it does have a very inclusive normative sample, especially when compared to other assessments. It kind of looked at all ethnicities. And we did, I wanted to mention previously on the slide about the normative sample that while the manual does not state specifically that it looks at socioeconomic status, I do feel that by looking at the parent and caregiver education level, it is somewhat looking at that socioeconomic status. So that kind of encompasses all areas of for that normative sample, and I do believe that normative sample is very great, and it provides a good idea of the standardization with the children it looked at, as well as adolescents and young adults. So the cons. One of the biggest cons when just looking at it is, I guess, since we're graduate students, $728 or $48 is a lot of money. So when we see that, that's like alarming. But I guess if you look at that, it is expensive. But at the end of the day, you are assessing a ton of children with that assessment, and it lasts for a few years until they come out with a new one. Then you got to buy it again. But it is expensive at first. Another con is that it is very time consuming. It can take, we did say earlier that it could be variable, but what we did see is like it can be 2 to 3 hours. And that is a lot of time spent on just, one assessment, while it does assess a lot of areas. I will say that. Another con is the lack of engagement. We noticed when administering this to each other that that there's not a lot of engagement, and if this test is going to take 2 to 3 hours, it's not exactly great that it's not very engaging because it can get kind of boring. But yeah, that would be our pros and cons for this assessment. And these are our references. Thank you for listening.